Hello everyone, I wanted to take some time to explain a hunt that was brought up in episode 1 of the podcast on wind and thermal. This particular hunt described how the wind traveled through some of the topography on an island to an open area, which ultimately the mature buck coming in was able to scent me and move out of the area because of that. Another reason why I wanted to show this, because it'll kind of segue into what we're going to talk about this week on the podcast, which is identifying sign, or different types of deer sign, and how it can be used to adjust your hunt. So, first thing I'd like to explain is some of the stuff I have drawn out here. See, we've got an island off to our east, and some wooded landmass off to our south. And the main island that we hunted here is kind of central in the diagram. The wind was coming out of the southwest across the island. It wasn't an ideal wind to hunt the area, but it was the last opportunity I had to hunt it, so I was going to go in and hunt it anyways. As you can see up here, in the transition between these two islands, this is swamp, cattail, redbrush, some very thick stuff. We identified an area that was a good doe bedding area. We had monitored deer come in and out of that on other hunts, as well as identified it on satellite maps that this could be a potential good doe bedding area. Area off the north tip of the island here, I know it's not quite clear on the map, but there are a few large trees dispersed out throughout here. So this in our mind was a potential area for a buck bed, and identified this here as a mature buck bed based on how this played out. On the lower part of the map here you'll see an immature buck bed, and I'll explain that later as I tell the story of how this played out. I've tried to draw some elevation lines in here to demonstrate how this island sort of jutted up out of the swamp, and the center of the island here is really the highest point. A couple other markers that I have in here are the large scrape and the fallen down rub tree that were positioned really at the center of the island. And then I've identified my stand location, as well as Dan's stand location that he picked out in postseason scouting when we came back to this area to re-verify what actually happened. So, and finally, I've marked on the map the open area in the center of this island where the timber opened up. There's a fairly high number of trees throughout this entire island here. This one area was relatively open. So, where should we begin? First I'll go in and I'll mark our access path that we took to get into the island. Typically our access path to this area was from the south, so we would travel in from the south, and because I didn't want to disturb the southern tip of that island, we chose to travel across this transition, come out the tip of the southeast island, go across the swamp, and enter here at this point. We mainly did that because of the predominant deer trails, and I'll explain that. There are a couple of deer trails that run down the center of this thing and branch out this way in transition. So depending on deer traffic, I didn't want to walk straight up those trails. I wanted to take the paths least traveled and come across the swamp this way. So that's why I chose that access route. Now, once I got in there, I walked straight up across the island and positioned myself right here on the downside, on the west side of the island, on the downside of this slope. Okay. I had the scrape off to my north at about 30 yards, and the rub tree was about 40 yards away from me, off to my north. Both within shooting distance if a deer came into it, but I had clear shooting lanes to both the scrape and the rub. Now, one thing to note about this, as I mentioned earlier, these two areas, we had noticed that there was old sign there in previous walks that we've gone through on this island. Nothing was opened up though. It was old rubs. There wasn't even any sign that this large scrape was there. There were some smaller scrapes that weren't being used on a regular basis on this island, but nothing to the magnitude of this scrape. So Dan was hunting some more parts of this land to the north when he was coming out of this island one night. He identified, walking out, that this rub tree had been freshly opened up. So there was fresh rubs on it in multiple spots on the tree. They were up high, and this scrape had been dug down a couple inches into the ground. So the two key things here about sign is that he identified as what he believed a buck coming in here and making this sign during daylight hours. The other thing to note about the time of the year, it was right around rut, so these two signs were probably being made by a mature deer that was coming in here to mark this area and doe travel. But the key part is that it was fresh sign, and there was something coming in there during daylight hours and working the scrape and the rub. So Dan didn't have an opportunity to get back here and hunt, so he called me up, told me about it, gave me general directions as to where to set up in an area that we had been before. So I was familiar with the area and I went in. The morning I got in here, again, I set up my tree stand right on the west side of the island on this lower elevation point so I could get shooting access to both the scrape and the rub. There is an open area right here. The wind was coming out of my southwest off my back shoulder. Now again, it wasn't ideal, but my thought on that is if there was a mature buck bedding off the tip of the island, and due to the topography of the island, that my wind and my scent would flow over the island and just miss potential doe bedding and buck bedding. Now it is a risk because the way this was flowing across here that my scent could go into doe bedding and kind of blow the whole thing up. And since I didn't know the exact location of the buck bed, the same is true for that. But there's a significant distance here. I mean, I'm more than 100 yards away from this buck bedding area and probably 75 yards away from this doe bedding area. So I got in here, got set up, didn't get a whole lot of action right at daybreak, but around 9 o'clock, 9:30, I started getting doe coming up out of this bedding area. So the first set of doe that came out, a couple doe walked onto the island here and dispersed off into the thick stuff in this pattern here. A couple minutes later, I had one doe come out, which I presumed to be a hot doe. She took the path straight up the center of the island, through the open transition. She actually leapt over the rub tree and ran almost to the base of my stand. At that point she started getting a little nervous. She stomped her foot a couple of times and then centered herself up in the middle of the island. At that point, as she was centered in the island, probably only about 5 to 10 yards from me, I heard some noise and motion from behind me, and a smaller, immature buck got up out of a bed and started coming this way towards the island. Now by that time the doe had already started making her way off the island. She headed out on those trails that I explained earlier that transitioned off this way. I couldn't really see her clearly behind me because of the thickness of the trees that was in there, but I could see the buck gave chase as he went along the transition here. So he never came onto the island, but he followed the transition and he gave chase to that doe off in this direction. So that was exciting, got my heart rate going. It was fun to see a buck get up and chase on a doe. Not 2 minutes later, I heard heavy footsteps coming out of the swamp, and you guys have probably all heard this coming out of the swamp in water where it's that heavy slosh, 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 slosh. Well, coming right off the tip of the island, traveling north to south. So my eyes were focused on the main access trail that I knew was on the tip of this island. And here came a big-bodied deer right down the center of the island. He got right to this opening and froze and held up. So again, the point I want to make here is that at this point I can make out that he's a big-bodied mature deer. Couldn't really tell how many points he had per se, but I knew he was a big-bodied deer. Now, my wind is coming off my back shoulder. Now, we talked about last time on the podcast how wind sort of flows like water. So what I'm imagining happening here, after looking at this after the fact, is that my scent, as it flows across the topography of this island, is actually swirling a bit here. Due to the tree lines and the elevation, my scent is actually coming in to this pool. Okay. Now, as it enters this, I'm probably getting a bit of a swirl here in this opening. Of my scent due to the way these trees are set up and the direction of the wind. So the wind's coming in, hitting the wall of the trees and pooling here. Plus this elevation is slightly lower than where I'm sitting at as it flows around. Now that mature buck came in right as he thought we would and held up right at this point. He did end up taking a few more steps up until this point. Enough to where I could get a good look at his body and tell that he was wide enough. That he looked like a good mainframe 8 to 10. But again, because of some of the cover here where this rub tree is, I couldn't make out in total what his rack looked like. My shooting lane was at the scrape and in between the rub tree and the scrape. So I didn't have a clear shooting lane where he was standing at there. He froze in this position for what seemed like several minutes, but probably was only for about 30 seconds. Then, all at once, he ran off. And I got a good look at the width of his rack and everything as he ran off the tip of the island here. Okay. So again, to recap this, and the important things I wanted you to take out of this. Fresh sign opened up. Because that fresh sign opened up, this is an area that we sort of had ignored before. We had hunted it a couple times, but weren't really keen on it just because we were hunting areas further north of it. Once this fresh sign opened up, we knew someone had to get in there and hunt it because there was something making the sign during daylight hours. We knew it was in close proximity to doe bedding, which means that these two buck beds were most likely rut beds that were being used to monitor this doe bedding area, both by the wind and by sight. So as any doe got onto this island, either to check the scrape, bucks bedding in either one of these beds could monitor that scrape and monitor any deer crossing on the high point of this island. So now where stand position comes into play. When we came back to this area in the postseason to actually scout it, I started explaining exactly where I was standing or exactly where I was sitting in my setup and how the deer came in and travel. And Dan had mentioned that, well, he actually would have picked his tree out to be right in this location. And his reasoning for picking that tree out in that location is because he would have been on the east side of the island, on the downside of the elevation, based on the predominant wind that was coming across. Being on the downside of the elevation, his theory is that his wind would have traveled a little further outside of the doe bedding area, in addition to the fact that this open area, he would have been on the east side of that open area, again not allowing his wind or his scent to pool in that open area. Now, as you can see, there's not a whole lot of distance between these two. We're talking 15 yards, 15, 20 yards most. But in this setup, it's slightly more north and more east, which potentially, based on the topography of this island, because it's on the downside, would have afforded my wind to actually travel. And I'll demonstrate that. Potentially could have afforded my wind to travel in this direction off the island. Now, even if it would have pooled or swirled a little bit in this direction based on, topography and how the layout of the timber was, it most likely would not have pooled in this area. Which, again, in hindsight, if you look at it, could have allowed this buck to keep traveling up the predominant trail to the scrape and within shooting range of where Dan's kill tree would have been. So, the other factor of this is you can sit and draw diagrams and pictures on maps all day long, but until you actually get out and you try one of these scenarios, try one of these setups and fail, which is exactly what happened to me in this situation, you'll never know how you can set up differently. I know next time I hunt this area, I'm going to get on the opposite side of the island, based on the wind again, of course, but if we identify this sign as opening up again, I'm going to get on the opposite side of the island. I know what tree I'm going to set up in now, and if this buck bed is being used off of here again, then my chances of setting up on any mature buck that's sitting in there have now increased because I've seen how it's played out once before. And I didn't mention this before, but we did actually walk into these areas in the postseason to identify this doe bedding and to identify this mature buck bed here. So we did confirm in the postseason that yes, in fact, there was a mature buck bed off this tip on these trees. Now, it might not be a bed that's being used all year round. It looked like one that, again, could be used during the rut, as was described here, but also as the cover and the foliage is a lot thicker in the early part of the season, it most likely is going to be used then. So, I hope this helps explain this hunt a little better and gives you kind of a better understanding about how to use the wind and how to use fresh sign to your advantage. So, like I said, this week's podcast is going to discuss deer sign and fresh sign and how to use it to your advantage. Thank you. Bye.